Homeless girl. Hid a SOS note in a donation box. Hours later. 500 bikers shut the street down. The girl's hands were shaking as she folded the paper for the third time, not from cold, from timing. She slid the note between two sweaters in the donation box, pressed it flat, and let go, because once the lid closed, they realized there was no way to take it back. If the wrong person opened that box, she would be found before nightfall. If the right one did, the street would never sound the same again. Before we continue, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. She had learned not to ask out loud. Out loud got you noticed in the wrong way. It got you labeled, watched, redirected, returned. Out loud turned you into a problem someone else needed to manage quickly. Quiet, on the other hand, could move through spaces without triggering alarms. Quiet could pass. Her name was Mara. 17, but the paperwork said 19 because 19 didn't come with questions. She lived between places. 2 nights behind a closed thrift store, 1 in a church stairwell if the weather turned, sometimes a couch that came with rules she followed carefully until they changed. She knew which sidewalks stayed warm longest after sunset, which intersections had cameras that actually worked, which ones were just there to make people feel safer. The man who controlled her movements didn't use chains. He used proximity. Rides that appeared when she needed them, meals that came with expectations, a phone that rang when she stepped too far off pattern. He never raised his voice. He never had to. He had learned how to sound helpful while closing exits. That morning, the city had announced a winter clothing drive outside the community center on Cedar Street. Donation bins lined the curb, volunteers smiling, music low enough to feel friendly. Mara watched from across the street for an hour, counting rotations, who checked the boxes, how often, where they were taken. She noticed the volunteer with the leather jacket first, not because of the jacket, but because he read the line of boxes like a mechanic reads an engine. He lifted lids, didn't just peek. He checked seams. He noticed weight. She waited. When the man who tracked her went inside to smoke, she crossed the street with a bag of clothes she didn't need anymore. She smiled. She thanked the volunteer. She lifted the lid and did exactly what she'd practiced in her head all night. The note was small. Pencil, not pen. Written blocky so it could be read fast, specific enough to be dangerous. A name, an address, a pattern. One sentence that mattered most. If I ask directly, I disappear. She didn't look back. By noon, the boxes were loaded into a truck and driven to a warehouse near the river. The city kept it locked, but the volunteer with the leather jacket had a key. He opened the first box and sorted without thinking. He opened the second and slowed. He found the note. He read it once, then again. He didn't smile. He didn't swear. He took a photo and made one call, voice low, words chosen like tools. He didn't say, "Emergency," he said, "Check this." Across town, Mara was walking a route she'd walked 100 times, head down, hands in pockets, counting reflections in windows to make sure she wasn't being followed. She didn't know the note had moved. She didn't know it had reached a table where people didn't panic and didn't forget. She only knew the air felt different. By 3 o'clock, the warehouse door opened and closed more times than it needed to. Phones buzzed and went quiet. Names were said without being written down. Addresses were verified by people who already knew the alleys. At 4, the street outside Cedar began to feel tight, not blocked, not loud, just occupied. Bikes arrived one by one and parked legally, leaving lanes open. A delivery truck turned away. A bus rerouted without complaint. At 5, someone knocked on the door of the building where Mara had been told to wait. Not hard, not soft, precise. She stood still, heart hammering, listening to footsteps outside, multiply, and then stop. Engines idled low, patient, like they could wait all night. She understood then what she had done. The note had not asked for help. It had asked for witnesses. Mara kept walking after the knock, not away from the door, away from the idea that it had changed anything yet. That was rule 1. Nothing is real until it proves it can last longer than fear. She took the stairs down 2 at a time, slipped out the side exit of the building, and merged into the late afternoon flow like she always did. People heading home, people carrying groceries, people who would remember her face for exactly 0 seconds. Good. The man who watched her preferred predictability, routes, times, patterns that felt safe because they repeated. Mara had learned to keep just enough of that intact to avoid triggering the phone calls. She cut left instead of right, slowed instead of sped up, stopped once to retie a lace she didn't need to retie. No footsteps matched hers, no voice called her name. The street felt tight, but not hostile, like a room that had filled with people who weren't talking yet. She crossed Cedar and headed toward the River District, the part of town where warehouses pretended to be empty and alleys told the truth. Hunger tugged at her ribs, familiar and manageable. She'd eaten a protein bar earlier, saved half for later. Later always came. She ducked into a narrow passage behind a closed print shop and leaned against the brick, counting breaths until the shake in her hands eased. The knock replayed in her head, not the sound, but the spacing. Deliberate, measured, not law enforcement, not the man, something else. Mara pushed off the wall and kept moving. She'd learned her invisibility early, long before she learned how to write a note small enough to survive a donation box. It came from being passed between systems that asked the same questions and recorded the same answers without ever noticing the gaps. Shelters that closed early, programs that filled fast, adults who spoke in soft tones and still managed to look through her. She stopped asking directly after the third time. Asking had made things worse. The man, she didn't call him anything else, had found her at a bus station 2 winters ago, offered coffee, offered a ride, offered help that came wrapped in conditions she didn't see until they tightened. He never touched her without permission. He never threatened her outright. He just removed options one by one until the only way forward looked like him. Phones work both ways, he'd said once, smiling. So do favors. Mara learned to move inside the cage. She kept walking until the light shifted and the river smell crept in. Metallic, cold, honest. The warehouse district was already waking up for the night shift. Forklifts beeped, doors rolled up, men and women clocked in with thermoses and blank expressions. She blended. At a corner near the loading docks, she paused and checked her reflection in a dark window. Hair tucked, jacket zipped, face neutral, no panic leaking through. That was rule 2. Fear shows before danger arrives. She felt it then, a vibration underfoot, subtle enough most people wouldn't clock it. Engines, not revving, not passing, idling somewhere nearby. Mara didn't look. She cut through a narrow gap between buildings and emerged onto a street that should have been louder at this hour. Instead, it felt contained. Cars moved slower than usual. A delivery van double-parked and then thought better of it. A cyclist turned around without signaling, like he'd hit an invisible wall. Witnesses, she thought. The note hadn't asked for rescue. She'd been careful about that. Rescue made noise. Rescue came with questions she couldn't answer safely. Witnesses stayed. She stopped at a corner and pretended to check her phone. Screen dark. The air held steady. No one rushed her. No one told her to move along. That was new. A motorcycle rolled past at walking speed, rider's head turning just enough to register her presence without fixing on it. Another followed. Then a third. They parked legally, cleanly, leaving space where space should be. Mara's pulse kicked up despite her best efforts. She crossed the street and entered a convenience store, letting the door chime announce her like any other customer. She grabbed a bottle of water and stood in line, counting the steps between the bikes outside. 1, 2, 3. The clerk didn't look nervous. He looked bored. She paid and left. Outside, the street had changed shape, not blocked, not crowded, just occupied. Men stood in 2s and 3s, talking quietly, eyes moving the way people's eyes move when they're there to notice rather than consume. This wasn't a raid. This was a hold. Mara walked past them without acknowledgement, heart hammering, and felt something unfamiliar press against her chest. Relief scared her more than fear. She reached the corner of Birch and stopped. The building she'd been told to wait in was behind her now. Ahead, the road bent toward the river and then out of sight. The man would be looking for her soon if he wasn't already. He would check the usual places first. The couch, the stairwell, the diner with the late shift. He wouldn't expect this. A voice spoke near her shoulder, calm and unintrusive. "You did the right thing." Mara didn't jump. She didn't turn quickly. She let her body settle before she looked. A woman stood there, mid-30s maybe, jacket plain, posture relaxed. No badge, no clipboard, hands visible. "I didn't do anything," Mara said. The woman nodded. "That's okay, I did." Mara's throat tightened. "Is this official?" The woman considered the word. "It's accurate." Mara scanned the street again. The bikes, the people, the space that felt held without being closed. "I can leave," Mara said. "Yes," the woman replied immediately, "and you can stay. Either way, no one's going to make you disappear tonight." Tonight. That word mattered. Mara exhaled slowly. "What happens now?" The woman tilted her head, listening to the street like it might answer first. "Now we wait long enough for the truth to show up." "And then?" "And then," the woman said, "you choose." Mara nodded once. Choice was something she understood in theory. Practice would take time. Down the block, engines idled in unison, low and patient. The street stayed open. Traffic moved where it was allowed to move. The city kept breathing. For the first time in a long while, so did Mara, without counting exits, without planning the run before it started. The note had left her hands hours ago. What it had set in motion was still arriving. The donation box had already been opened once before anyone realized it mattered. The warehouse smelled like dust, fabric softener, and old cardboard, the neutral scent of things people no longer wanted, but still felt good giving away. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Volunteers moved in practiced rhythms, sorting without thinking, hands faster than eyes. The man in the leather jacket, Tom, had been doing this long enough to trust patterns. Boxes came in full, boxes went out empty. Every now and then, something didn't weigh the way it should. He noticed the weight first, too light for winter coats, too uneven for folded clothes. He lifted the lid, reached inside, and felt paper where there shouldn't have been paper, not a receipt, not a thank you note. He unfolded it slowly. Pencil, block letters, pressed hard enough to bruise the page. Tom didn't read it out loud. He didn't swear. He didn't look around for permission. He read it once, then again. Then he folded it back exactly the way it had been and slid it into his jacket pocket like it had always lived there. He stepped away from the table, pulled out his phone, and didn't call the police. He called a number that never went to voicemail. "Check this," he said when the line picked up. No urgency in his voice, just precision. "Donation box, Cedar Street, specifics inside." There was a pause on the other end, not confusion, recognition. "Send it," the voice said. Tom took a photo of the note against the warehouse floor, making sure the edges were clear, the pressure marks visible, the handwriting legible. He sent it and waited. He didn't put the note back. Across the city, Mara kept moving. She crossed into the warehouse district because it was honest about being ugly. No curated storefronts, no people pretending to care while calculating risk, just work, noise, and people too tired to perform. She stayed on the outer edge of the street where shadows pooled and light didn't reach cleanly. The man hadn't called yet. That meant one of two things. He didn't know. Or he knew and was deciding how to respond. Both were dangerous. Mara ducked into an alley and leaned against a dumpster that still radiated a little warmth from the day. She closed her eyes and counted, 5 breaths in, 5 out, until the hum in her ears settled. She didn't know the note had been read. She only knew she'd crossed a line she couldn't uncross. Back at the warehouse, Tom's phone buzzed again. "Who wrote it?" the voice asked. "Girl," Tom said. "Teen. Knows what she's saying." Another pause. Then, "Any cameras on Cedar?" "Some," Tom replied. "Not the ones that matter." "Good," the voice said. "Don't touch anything else." Tom leaned against the loading dock railing and watched a truck back in, beeping steadily. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" "Yes," the voice answered, "and I don't like coincidences." The call ended. Within 20 minutes, the warehouse stopped feeling empty. Not crowded, never crowded, but aware. A pickup rolled in and parked legally. 2 men got out, didn't come inside, just stood where they could see the street. Another truck arrived from the opposite direction. Someone brought coffee and set it down without asking who wanted it. Nobody said the word emergency. They said things like, "Check the address," and "Who else works that corner," and "What time does the truck come through?" Quiet questions, accurate ones. On Cedar Street, Mara felt the air tighten further, not closing, focusing. She watched a city bus slow, then reroute without the usual irritation. She watched a man cross the street, see the bikes, and decide against lighting a cigarette. The man who controlled her movements would notice this kind of shift. He was good at that. Her phone vibrated. She didn't answer. It vibrated again. She stopped walking, heart pounding, and pulled it from her pocket. One missed call. No message. He never left messages. Mara slipped the phone back and kept moving, forcing her steps to stay even. Panic burned energy she couldn't afford to lose. She cut down a side street and entered a laundromat that smelled like detergent and heat. Inside, the TV played a daytime talk show nobody watched. A woman folded towels methodically. Two men argued quietly about which dryer worked best. Mara sat on a plastic chair and waited. Minutes passed. No footsteps followed her in. No voice called her name. When she stepped back outside, the street had changed again. More bikes now. Still legal. Still quiet. One rider stood near a parking meter, helmet under his arm, eyes tracking reflections in store windows instead of people directly. Another leaned against a lamppost, checking his phone, posture relaxed but planted. Mara understood then. The note had been opened by someone who knew how to read what wasn't written. She crossed Birch and stopped short when she saw the man. He stood near the entrance to the building she'd left earlier, phone to his ear, jaw tight. His eyes scanned the street in quick, controlled sweeps. He was looking for disruption, for noise, for a reason to escalate. He didn't see her. Not yet. Mara turned away slowly and moved with the crowd, angling toward the river where the street widened and sightlines broke. Her hands shook now, not uncontrollably, but enough that she pressed them into her jacket sleeves to hide it. She felt a presence near her shoulder again. Different voice this time. Male, calm, close enough to hear without raising volume. "Don't turn around," he said. She didn't. "You did the smart thing," the voice continued. "You picked a place that doesn't lie." Mara swallowed. "I didn't ask for you." "No," the man said. "You asked for witnesses." She nodded barely. "If I keep walking," Mara said, "he'll follow." "Yes," the man replied. "And if you stop." "He'll corner me," the man paused. "Then don't stop alone." They reached the corner where Cedar met the river road. The space opened. Cars slowed. The man behind her drifted closer, uncertainty creeping into his posture. Mara turned. She saw it all at once. The bikes, not blocking, not threatening, just there. Men and women positioned at intervals that made flight complicated without making it impossible. Faces calm, eyes steady. The man froze. He recognized the shift even if he didn't understand it. Mara stepped forward, heart hammering so hard it felt like it might tear free. A rider met her halfway, palms open, voice level. "You Mara," she nodded. "You don't have to answer anything right now," he said. "You can keep walking, or you can stand here. Either way, you're not alone." The man took a step back, then another. He didn't run. Running would have been noticed. He disappeared into the side street instead, phone already out, making a call that wouldn't go the way he wanted. Mara exhaled, shaky and deep. The rider didn't touch her, didn't crowd her. "Your note got where it needed to go," he said. She laughed once, breathless. "I didn't know if anyone would read it." He nodded. "We read it." Behind them, engines idled low, patient. The street held, and for the first time since she'd learned how to stay invisible, Mara stood in plain sight without shrinking. The box had been opened. Now the city had to look inside. The street didn't close. It narrowed. That was the difference Mara felt first. Not a wall, not a trap, but a subtle compression of space that made certain choices harder without removing them entirely. Cars still passed, pedestrians still moved. The city kept pretending it was a normal afternoon, but the gaps between things had changed, and the wrong kind of movement now stood out. The man who controlled her movements felt it too. Mara saw it in the way his shoulders lifted when he stepped out of the side street, phone still in his hand, eyes darting. He'd expected chaos if something went wrong. Sirens, shouting, authority arriving loud enough to challenge. This wasn't that. This was worse for him. He scanned the street again, slower this time, counting bikes the way someone counts exits in a room that's grown unfamiliar. His posture shifted from ownership to calculation, from confidence to caution. Mara stayed where she was. That alone was a victory. The rider who'd met her halfway didn't move closer. He didn't offer a jacket, didn't put a hand on her arm, didn't do anything that could be mistaken for control. He stood angled slightly away, giving her a line of sight down the street and another behind him. "Do you want to sit?" he asked. Mara shook her head. "Sitting made you smaller. Sitting made people decide you were finished." "Okay," he said. "Then we stand." Behind them, the street settled into a rhythm that felt deliberate. 2 bikes rolled in and parked legally near a crosswalk. Another stopped by a meter that had already expired, rider feeding it coins with exaggerated patience. A delivery truck approached, slowed, then turned down a different road. No one blocked anything, everything redirected. The man took another step back. "Don't," he said finally, voice tight, aimed at no one in particular. "You don't know what you're doing." The rider turned just enough to look at him, not threatening, curious. "Tell me," the rider said calmly, "what we're doing." The man opened his mouth, closed it, looked past the rider at the bikes, the people, the invisible net forming without being declared. "You think this scares me," he said, louder now. He was trying to summon volume into power. "No," the rider replied. "We think it slows you down." That landed. Mara felt it in her chest, a small, sharp click of something aligning. The man glanced at her then, really looked at her like he was seeing a variable he hadn't accounted for. "You're making this worse for yourself," he said, softer now, dangerous, soft. Mara didn't answer him. She spoke to the rider instead. "If I walk away," she said, "he'll follow later." The rider nodded. "Yes." "And if I stay?" "He can't move without being seen," the rider replied. "That's the difference." Mara weighed the words, not for truth, she already knew they were true, but for cost. Staying meant exposure. It meant her face might be remembered by people who'd learned to forget her. It meant the man couldn't quietly fold her back into his pattern tonight. It meant escalation. She stayed. The man took another step back, then stopped when a bike rolled up behind him, engine idling low. The rider didn't dismount, didn't speak, just existed in the man's peripheral vision like a door that had been there all along. "You need to leave," the rider behind him said, voice even. The man laughed, brittle. "You can't tell me where to stand." "Correct," the rider replied, "but we can decide how long we stand here." The man's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, then shoved it back into his pocket like it had betrayed him. Mara noticed his hands shaking. Good, she thought, not because she wanted him afraid, but because fear made him sloppy. A woman approached from the opposite side of the street, mid-40s, plain coat, eyes alert. She didn't look at Mara at first. She looked at the man. "Sir," the woman said, "are you with her?" The man straightened instinctively. "Yes." The woman waited. Mara felt the pause stretch like a held breath. "No," the man corrected quickly. "I mean, I'm helping her." The woman turned to Mara then, finally, meeting her eyes directly. "Is that true?" Mara shook her head once. The woman nodded. "Thank you." She stepped aside and spoke quietly into a phone that hadn't been visible a moment before. Not calling for backup, calling to log something. Paperwork was beginning to form. The man backed up another step. The street narrowed further. By the time the first uniformed officer arrived, alone, unhurried, the dynamic had already set. The officer took in the scene with practiced neutrality. Bikes parked legally, traffic flowing, no raised voices, no physical contact. "What's going on?" the officer asked. The woman answered before anyone else could. "I observed a minor being followed by an adult who claimed to be assisting her. She denied that claim." The officer nodded, eyes moving to Mara. "You okay?" Mara swallowed. Her throat was dry. "I am right now." The officer accepted that answer for what it was. "Do you want to speak somewhere else?" Mara looked at the rider beside her. He didn't nod, didn't shake his head. Choice stayed with her. "Yes," she said, "but not alone." The officer glanced at the bikes again, then back to Mara. "Okay." The man exploded then, frustration finally burning through control. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "She's wasting everyone's time." The officer's gaze hardened. "Sir, I'm going to ask you to step back." "I didn't do anything wrong," the man insisted. "Then this won't be a problem," the officer replied. The man hesitated. Long enough. That was all it took. Mara didn't see who moved first. She only felt the space around her solidify, the bikes adjusting by inches, the line of sight changing. The man found himself with fewer directions to choose from, and none of them clean. He stepped back. Then another. Then turned and walked away fast enough to look like he wasn't running. No one followed him. That was intentional. The officer turned back to Mara. "Let's go talk." They didn't go to a car. They went to a cafe on the corner that had stayed open longer than planned because the street felt different tonight. The officer sat at one table. The woman sat at another. The rider stayed by the window, coffee untouched, presence quiet and immovable. Mara talked. Not everything, not the whole story, just enough to make the pattern visible without handing over control. Names, places, how rides appeared when she needed them and disappeared when she didn't comply. How asking directly had always made things worse. The officer listened without interrupting. When Mara finished, the officer closed his notebook and said something that made her blink. "You did the right thing." Mara laughed softly, disbelieving. "I hid a note in a box." "Yes," the officer said, "and because of that you were seen by people who know how to stay." Outside, more bikes arrived, not rushing, not clustering. The cafe filled with a low, steady hum of engines idling, then quieting. By the time Mara stepped back onto the sidewalk, the street was no longer hers alone, but it wasn't taken from her either. It was held. Someone handed her a cup of hot chocolate without comment. Someone else moved a chair so she could sit if she wanted. She didn't. The woman in the plain coat stood beside her. "You don't have to decide anything tonight," she said, "but you won't be alone if you stay." Mara looked down the street where the man had disappeared. The familiar fear was still there, coiled and watchful, but it no longer filled the entire space. She nodded. "I'll stay," she said. For now." The engines remained low and patient as evening deepened. Traffic rerouted naturally. Shops closed without incident. The city adjusted its posture around a girl who had finally refused to vanish quietly. The donation box had done its work. Now the street itself was a witness, and it wasn't done holding. By the 5th hour, the street had learned a new rhythm. Not louder, not faster, slower, denser, like a held breath that refused to release until it knew what it was breathing for. Mara felt it in her calves first, the ache of standing too long without the relief of motion, then in her shoulders, where tension usually lived full time and now had competition. She stayed upright. Sitting still felt like surrender. The cafe windows fogged as night crept in. Inside, people spoke softly, cups clinked, a radio murmured news that hadn't caught up yet. Outside, bikes continued to arrive, not in a rush, not in a line, but with intention. Each one parked where it was allowed, where it mattered, where it changed how the street behaved without announcing itself. Someone counted quietly. 50. Then 100. Then stopped counting because the number had stopped being the point. Mara leaned against the brick wall near the cafe entrance and watched faces, not the bikers, but everyone else's. The shop owner across the street locked his door earlier than usual, then unlocked it again when he realized no one was threatening him. A woman walking her dog crossed the street twice, uncertain, then relaxed when nothing happened. A delivery driver sat in his truck and waited, engine off, scrolling his phone like patience was something he could afford tonight. The city was being taught how to pause. The woman in the plain coat, Claire, returned with a paper cup and held it out without insisting. Mara took it and wrapped her hands around the heat. "Any calls?" Mara asked. Claire nodded. "A few, not the ones that panic." Mara understood. Panic made noise. Noise drew attention of the wrong kind. "What about him?" Mara asked. "He's trying to reassert normal," Claire said. "That's a tell." Mara stared down the street, imagining him slipping back into places that had once closed behind her. "Normal never fit," she said. Claire didn't argue. A man approached then, not a biker, not a cop. Mid-40s, jacket zipped, posture careful. He stopped a respectful distance away and spoke to Claire first. "I manage the shelter on Pine," he said. "Someone said a girl here might need a bed." Mara stiffened automatically. Claire glanced at Mara, then back to the man. "She's deciding." The man nodded, no offense taken. "Doors open," he said. "No intake tonight." Mara looked at him. "No forms?" "Tomorrow," he replied. "If you want." She held his gaze for a long second, searching for the angle. Found none. "Thank you," she said. He left without pressing. That mattered more than the offer. Across the street, a black sedan slowed, then stopped too long at the curb. The driver didn't get out. The engine idled. Mara felt the familiar prickle crawl up her spine. Claire noticed it too. 2 bikes repositioned, just enough to occupy the space in front of the sedan without blocking it. A rider leaned on his handlebars and checked his phone. Another sat on a low wall and tied his boot like he had all the time in the world. The sedan waited, then moved on. Mara exhaled slowly. By 8 o'clock, the count reached something that changed how people spoke about it later. Not 500 yet, but close enough that the street had to acknowledge it. Every open parking space within 3 blocks was taken by a bike, a truck, a car that had chosen to stay instead of pass through. No chants, no signs, no speeches, just a fact the city had to root around. A uniformed officer arrived with a partner, neither in a hurry. They walked the block once, nodding to riders, checking plates they didn't need to check, confirming what their eyes already told them. Nothing illegal, nothing chaotic, nothing they could shut down without explanation. The officer stopped near Mara and spoke carefully. "You feel safe here?" Mara didn't rush the answer. She scanned the block, the bikes, the cafe, the open spaces where nothing bad was happening. "Safer than I did this morning," she said. The officer nodded. "That's what I needed to hear." They moved on. The night thickened. Food appeared without ceremony. Boxes set on hoods, bottles of water passed hand to hand. Someone turned down the cafe radio so the hum of engines didn't compete with it. Mara noticed how the bikers checked in with each other. Quiet looks, nods, hands on shoulders that didn't linger. This wasn't adrenaline. This was maintenance. Claire returned with her phone and showed Mara a screen. A photo, a donation box, open lid. The note blurred just enough to protect handwriting. "They verified the address," Claire said. "The pattern. Other girls." Mara's stomach tightened. Other girls. "Yes," Claire said. "You weren't the first." Mara swallowed hard. Relief and grief tangled together in a way that hurt worse than fear ever had. "What happens to him?" Mara asked. Claire didn't answer immediately. She chose precision. "What happens next won't be quick, but it will be hard for him to make anyone disappear quietly again." Mara nodded. Quietly was the part that mattered. A bike rolled up close enough that Mara recognized the rider, the one who'd first spoken to her. He removed his helmet and held it under his arm. "They're rerouting traffic," he said. "City asked for help keeping lanes clear." Mara blinked. "They asked you?" He smiled faintly. "They asked for calm." She looked down the block and saw it. Temporary barricades going up at the corners, not closing the street but controlling flow. A city truck idled with its lights on, cones appearing where cones had never mattered before. The street was being officially acknowledged. By 9, the number crossed the line people would remember later. 500 bikes. No one announced it, no one cheered. It simply became true. Mara felt it then, not triumph, not safety, but something steadier. Weight shifting off her chest and onto the ground beneath her feet. The street held because enough people had decided to hold it. The man did not return. That absence spoke louder than any confrontation. Claire stood beside Mara, voice low. "You can leave if you want. You can stay. You can sleep. You can walk away tomorrow." Mara stared at the bikes, the people, the city, bending without breaking. "If I leave," she said, "will it stop?" Claire shook her head. "No, this isn't about keeping you here." Mara closed her eyes briefly. The donation box, the folded paper, the moment she'd let go. "I didn't think anyone would read it," she said. Claire replied softly. "You wrote it like someone who needed the right eyes." By 10, the block felt almost normal again. If normal meant a city learning how to look at itself. Riders talked about routes and weather. A mechanic fixed a loose mirror under a streetlight. Someone laughed quietly, surprised by the sound. Mara stayed standing, not because she was afraid to sit, but because standing felt like choosing. She took a step forward, then another, testing the space. Nothing pushed back. The street didn't own her. She owned her place in it. The engine stayed low and patient as the night deepened, 500 witnesses holding a line that could not be folded away like a note. And for the first time since she'd learned how to vanish, Mara understood something clearly. Being seen didn't have to mean being taken. Sometimes it meant being held long enough to decide where to go next. By the 6th hour after nightfall, the street had stopped feeling like an event and started feeling like infrastructure. Mara noticed it in the way people moved without looking for permission. A courier pushed a cart through the open lane that had been left for exactly that purpose. A cyclist dismounted and walked his bike through the narrowest part without being told. A city worker adjusted a cone, stepped back, and checked sightlines like he was calibrating a machine that had to keep working after everyone went home. The presence wasn't loud anymore. It was functional. Mara stood near the cafe entrance, shoulders loose now, weight balanced on both feet. She hadn't sat. She hadn't needed to. The cup of hot chocolate had gone cold in her hands without her noticing. She set it on the ledge beside the door and let it be. Claire returned with a small notepad, not a clipboard. She spoke softly, like you do when the room has learned to listen. "We need to document what happened," she said. "Not tonight, but I want to explain how it will work so nothing surprises you later." Mara nodded. "Okay. You won't be asked to relive anything you don't choose to," Claire continued. "You'll have a say in where you go next, and no one will contact him on your behalf." Mara flinched at the last word. "He'll try to contact me anyway." "Yes," Claire said, "and when he does, there will be a record." A record. That word felt heavier than safety, lighter than a promise. Across the street, a cluster of riders shifted positions, not reacting, anticipating. Mara followed their gaze and saw the man again, farther down the block this time, trying to pass through a gap that had existed an hour ago and didn't anymore. He stopped, looked around, made a show of checking his phone. No one addressed him. No one needed to. A rider leaned against a light pole 20 feet away and tied his boot again, slow and thorough. Another checked the time on his dash. The man waited, irritation bleeding into his posture, then turned and walked back the way he'd come, faster now, pride giving way to calculation. Mara felt something settle. Not relief, alignment. This wasn't about chasing him away. It was about removing the quiet places he needed to operate. By 10:30, the number of bikes thinned and thickened in waves. People rotated out to sleep and rotated in to hold space. It wasn't heroic. It was scheduled. Maintenance disguised as solidarity. A rider she hadn't spoken to before approached, helmet under his arm, eyes steady. "You hungry?" he asked. Mara hesitated, then nodded. He handed her a paper bag and stepped back. Inside, a sandwich, simple, wrapped tight so it would hold heat longer. No comment, no expectation. She ate slowly, aware of the way hunger tried to hurry her and choosing not to let it. The bread tasted like nothing special. That was perfect. At 11, a city official arrived, not in a suit, not with a camera. He walked the block with Claire and 2 officers, stopping to ask questions that had answers. He nodded, took notes, made a call, then looked up at the riders with something like relief. "Traffic control's in place," he said. "We'll keep the partial closure through morning." A rider nodded back. "We'll keep lanes clear." The official blinked, then smiled. "That helps." Mara watched the exchange and felt a strange sensation, power, but not the kind she'd learned to fear. This power didn't corner, it coordinated. She stepped away from the wall and took a few careful steps down the block, testing the space. No one reacted. No one adjusted around her. She turned back toward Claire. "If I leave now," she said, "will it break?" Claire shook her head. "No, this isn't a cage." Mara nodded. "Good." She walked to the curb and sat, feet planted, back straight. Sitting didn't feel like surrender anymore. It felt like rest. The street breathed. At midnight, a drizzle began. Not enough to test the drains, just enough to remind everyone why they were here. The pavement darkened, reflections sharpened, engines idled lower, patient. Mara closed her eyes for a moment and listened, not for danger, for patterns. The way sound moved around corners, the way people adjusted without being told, the way the city learned when it was given time. She opened her eyes to find Claire watching her, not closely, just present. "You okay?" Claire asked. "Yes," Mara said, and for once it wasn't a performance. They talked quietly then, not about the man, not about the note, but about ordinary things. Where Mara had learned to read rooms, how long she'd been on her own, which places she avoided because the quiet there was the wrong kind. Claire listened without interrupting, without trying to fix the story. At one point, a rider passed and nodded to Mara like she belonged there. Not as a guest, not as a cause, as a person occupying space. That mattered. By 1, the street had taught itself how to function with the presence folded in. The cafe closed without drama. The lights dimmed. The last delivery truck turned away early and didn't complain. Mara stood again, stretching her legs, feeling the fatigue settle honestly. She looked down the block where the man had last been seen and felt the old fear flicker, and then fail to take hold. "He won't come back tonight," she said. Claire nodded. "No." "And tomorrow?" "Tomorrow he'll have to explain himself to people who write things down," Claire said. Mara smiled faintly. "He hates that." By 2, the rotation thinned again. 100 bikes remained, then fewer. Not leaving, holding. The number no longer mattered. The shape did. Mara pulled her jacket tighter and leaned back against the wall, eyes half closed, listening to the rain whisper against metal and brick. She wasn't asleep. She wasn't running scenarios. She was present. The donation box felt like a lifetime ago. The folded paper. The moment of letting go. She'd thought the risk ended there. She'd been wrong. The risk had changed shape. Now it lived in daylight and paperwork and witnesses who stayed. At 3, Claire stood and stretched. "We can walk," she said. "Just a bit, if you want." Mara nodded. They walked the block together, slow and unremarkable, 2 figures moving through a space that had learned how to hold without gripping. As they passed the corner, Mara glanced once more at the place where the street narrowed and then opened again. "It feels different," she said. Claire agreed. "That's because it is." They returned to the cafe doorway, now dark, and stood there while the rain thinned and stopped. By 4, the city slept. The presence remained. Mara rested her head against the brick and closed her eyes, not to disappear, not to hide, but to feel the ground under her feet and know it would still be there when she opened them again. The street had done something rare. It had chosen to stay awake. And for now, that was enough. The 7th hour after midnight felt heavier than the rest, not because anything new happened, but because nothing did. The street held its shape without effort now. The bikes that remained were fewer, spaced wider, no longer correcting movement because movement had learned. The rain had stopped completely, leaving the pavement dark and reflective, streetlights stretching long gold lines that didn't tremble anymore. Mara noticed the difference immediately. This was the dangerous part. When pressure worked, people relaxed. When people relaxed, systems tried to quietly reset. She'd seen it happen before. After bad nights, after loud scenes, after everyone promised something would be different this time. She stayed alert. Claire noticed and didn't comment. They stood near the corner where Cedar narrowed, backs to the brick wall, watching the city test the edges again. A taxi slowed, then proceeded. A delivery van stopped too long, then moved on. A man stepped out of a bar 2 blocks down, took in the bikes, and decided tonight wasn't the night to argue with anyone. Presence had become instruction. At 2:30, a different kind of vehicle arrived. Not police, not city. A black SUV with tinted windows rolled in slowly and parked where it technically shouldn't have, but no one challenged it yet. The engine stayed running, the windows stayed up. Mara felt it immediately. "That's new," she said quietly. Claire nodded. "Yes." A rider across the street shifted his stance, weight moving subtly to the balls of his feet. Another checked his phone and then didn't put it away. No escalation, just readiness. The SUV door opened. A man stepped out wearing a suit that didn't belong to the hour. His shoes were too clean for the sidewalk. His posture was practiced authority, the kind that expected cooperation because it usually got it. He scanned the street, the bikes, the cafe frontage, and then focused on Claire. "You in charge here?" he asked. Claire didn't answer right away. "No," she said finally, "but I'm present." The man smiled thinly. "I'm here to de-escalate." Mara almost laughed. Claire tilted her head. "From what?" The man gestured vaguely at the street. "This situation." Claire looked around. "Traffic is flowing. No disturbances, no threats." The man's smile tightened. "We've received calls." "So have we," Claire replied. The man's eyes flicked to Mara then, quick, assessing, already filing her into a category that fit his paperwork. And the girl, he asked. Mara spoke before Claire could. I'm standing. The man looked mildly surprised. You don't need all this. Mara met his gaze evenly. I needed witnesses. The man frowned. You've made your point. No, Mara said. I made a note. Silence tightened around them, not hostile, but unmistakable. The man cleared his throat. The street can't stay closed like this. It isn't closed, Claire said. It's occupied. That's semantics. No, Claire replied. That's legality. A rider nearby leaned casually against his bike and checked his watch. Another adjusted a cone that had shifted half an inch. Small movements, deliberate. The man in the suit exhaled through his nose. You're creating liability, Claire nodded. So is ignoring a written SOS with verifiable details. That landed. The man glanced back at the SUV, then at the riders again. He was calculating. Not safety, not fairness, exposure. And him? He asked, lowering his voice. Is he still nearby? Mara felt the familiar spike, but it didn't take hold. Yes, she said. And no. The man turned sharply. Which is it? Yes, he's nearby, Mara continued calmly. No, he can't reach me without being seen. The man studied her longer now, not dismissively, carefully. You understand this won't end tonight, he said. Mara nodded. That's why I didn't ask for tonight. Claire stepped in gently. We're not negotiating silence. The man straightened, smile gone. Neither am I. He took out his phone, typed something, then put it away. We'll revisit in the morning, he said, with different people. Claire nodded. We'll be here. The man hesitated, then looked at Mara again. You could have handled this quietly, Mara replied without hesitation. Quiet is what trapped me. The man didn't respond. He got back into the SUV and drove away without slamming the door. Only after the taillights disappeared did the street breathe again. Good answer, Claire said quietly. Mara's hands shook now, not with fear, but with the delayed release of holding steady through power she didn't control. A rider approached and handed her a bottle of water without comment. She drank. By 3, the bikes rotated again. Fewer remained, but the ones that stayed looked like they could stay until morning without complaint. Sleeping bags appeared quietly. Someone passed out hand warmers. No announcements, no gratitude speeches. This wasn't charity. This was coverage. Mara leaned back against the wall and let herself sit. Her legs trembled with exhaustion. She didn't fight it. Claire sat beside her, not too close. You held that well. I'm used to people trying to shrink me, Mara said. Claire nodded. Tonight you didn't. Across the street, a rider laughed softly at something mundane, a joke about weather apps always being wrong. The sound was brief, human, grounding. Mara closed her eyes for a moment and listened, not for danger, for continuity. She felt it then, the subtle shift from being protected to being part of the environment, no longer the center, no longer the trigger, just another person occupying space that had learned to hold. That was new. At 4, the sky began to lighten, the gray of pre-dawn bleeding into the black. The city stirred. Early workers appeared at the edges, confused but not alarmed. They adjusted routes and went on with their lives. The presence remained. When the sun finally broke the horizon, it didn't change much. The street looked almost ordinary, except for the bikes, the cones, the people who didn't leave when they could have. Mara stood again, stretching slowly. I don't want to disappear after this, she said quietly. Claire looked at her. Then don't, Mara nodded. I don't want to be owned either. You won't be, Claire replied. The city tested the space one more time, sending a street sweeper through the open lane. It passed without incident. The street accepted it. That was the final confirmation. By morning, the story had shifted beyond rumor. Paperwork was moving. Names were being connected to other names in other places. The man who controlled her movements hadn't returned. He wouldn't, not without witnesses. Mara watched the light strengthen and felt something unfamiliar settle in her chest. Not safety. Agency. She hadn't been rescued. She had been backed up. The donation box had started it. The street had finished it. And as dawn spread across Cedar, Mara understood something clearly for the first time. Visibility wasn't the opposite of survival. It was the thing that finally made survival stop being temporary. By the 8th day, the street had learned how to remember. Not everything. Cities never do. But enough to change how it answered familiar questions. When delivery trucks approached Cedar now, they slowed earlier. When buses rolled through, they didn't hug the curb where the donation bins had stood. The cones were gone, but the habit remained, like a scar that still knew where the bone had broken. Mara noticed it without trying. She woke in the small room above the cafe where Claire had arranged for her to stay until paperwork catches up with reality. The window faced the street. Morning light fell across brick and asphalt that looked ordinary again, and that ordinariness felt earned. She sat on the edge of the bed and listened. No engines idling in chorus now, no low hum of presence holding the line. Just the city waking up and testing itself. Her phone buzzed once, a message from a number she didn't recognize. Morning check. You good? No signature, no pressure. Mara typed back 2 words and stopped there. Still here. Downstairs, the cafe smelled like coffee and toast. The owner nodded at her like she belonged to the rhythm of the place now, like she wasn't a complication that needed to be managed quickly. Mara poured herself a cup and stood by the window, watching pedestrians move without that sidelong calculation she'd learned to read. The man hadn't come back. That absence was information. Claire joined her a moment later, jacket on, keys in hand. We're walking, she said, not a question. They stepped onto Cedar and moved toward the river at an easy pace. No escort, no bikes flanking them. The street accepted them without comment. That mattered more than anything that had happened at night. At the underpass, work continued. Fresh concrete cured where the angle had been recut. A new drain grate sat lower, wider, honest about where water wanted to go. An engineer crouched with a clipboard, tapping notes into a tablet, then stood and watched as a worker sprayed a hose down the slope. The water hesitated, then spread, then slid sideways where it had been told to. Mara felt something loosen in her chest. You see it, the engineer said, noticing her attention. Yes, Mara replied. It's listening. The engineer smiled faintly. We're trying. They walked on. The river was calm, reflecting a sky that couldn't decide whether it wanted to rain again. Mara leaned on the railing and watched the surface move without hurry. She remembered the way the street had narrowed without closing, how presence had taught the city to hold itself differently. You don't have to do anything today, Claire said, reading her posture. No statements, no meetings. Mara nodded. I know. But you want to, Claire added. Mara considered it. I want to understand how it sticks. How what sticks? Witness, Mara said. After people go home. Claire rested her forearms on the railing. It sticks when it becomes boring. Mara huffed a breath. That's disappointing. It's reliable, Claire said. They turned back toward the cafe. On the way, a man approached, early 30s, clean jacket, careful stance. He stopped at a respectful distance and addressed Claire first. I'm with Municipal Services, he said. We're setting up a storm response protocol for the block. We'd like your input. Claire tilted her head. Mine? And hers, he said, nodding toward Mara, if she's willing. Mara felt the old reflex fire. Decline, deflect, disappear. She let it pass. What kind of input? She asked. Patterns, the man replied. Where people stand when they shouldn't. Where water pretends it won't go. Mara met his eyes. I don't want my name on anything. He nodded immediately. You don't have to. And I can leave whenever I want. Yes, he said. That's kind of the point. Mara looked at the street again. The cafe door, the river. The underpass that had been taught something new. I'll talk, she said. I won't teach. The man smiled. Talking is plenty. By midday, the block had resumed its regular tempo. Shops opened, a lunch crowd came and went. Someone played music too loud from a car and turned it down when they saw a delivery truck struggling to pull out. Small adjustments, learned behaviors. Mara sat at a corner table and sketched a rough map on a napkin, not of streets but of movement, where sound pooled, where light lied, where silence turned predatory. She slid it across to Claire without ceremony. That's useful, Claire said. It's temporary, Mara replied, like everything. Yes, Claire agreed, but temporary things can be revisited. In the afternoon, the woman who ran the Pine shelter stopped by. No clipboard this time, no intake forms. Door's still open, she said to Mara. Same terms. Mara nodded. Thank you. She meant it, and she didn't feel owned by the gratitude. At 4, the black SUV returned. It didn't stop on Cedar. It slowed at the end of the block, idled, then moved on. The driver didn't get out. The windows stayed up. The street didn't react. Mara watched until it disappeared. He's testing, she said. Yes, Claire replied, and failing. That evening, bikes returned. Not 500, not even 50. 6, parked wide, quiet check-ins, nods exchanged, no ceremony. A rider she recognized from the first night leaned against a pole and looked at the underpass like he was memorizing it. Holds, he said. For now, Mara replied. He smiled. That's the honest answer. As dusk settled, Mara felt the familiar pull to move again, not from fear, but from momentum. She walked the block twice, testing the edges, and found them intact. She stopped at the corner and breathed in the smell of dinner cooking somewhere nearby. I don't want to live inside this, she said softly to Claire. Claire nodded. Then don't. I want to leave knowing it doesn't fold back up. Claire followed her gaze. It won't. Not the same way. Mara stood a moment longer, then turned toward the cafe stairs. She packed her bag lightly, habit, and paused at the window. The street looked ordinary again. That ordinariness felt like proof. She went downstairs and stepped out into the evening, choosing a direction that wasn't away from anything, just forward. Behind her, Cedar kept its shape. The river slid as instructed. The underpass waited for the next storm, with a different answer ready. Ahead of her, the city opened into routes she hadn't needed before. Mara walked with her hands free, eyes up, not counting exits. The note had been read. The street had listened. Now it was her turn to decide where to go next. By the 9th evening, the city had stopped arguing with itself. Not publicly, cities rarely admit that part, but in the way systems quietly align when resistance costs more than adjustment. Permits were extended without debate. Temporary measures became scheduled ones. The block that had learned to hold stayed held, even as attention drifted elsewhere. Mara felt it when she walked Cedar at dusk and nobody flinched. No heads snapped up. No phones came out. The cafe door opened and closed on time. The bus paused where it should and moved on. The street had absorbed the lesson and moved it into muscle memory. She stood at the corner and watched the light change, letting the moment prove itself. Claire met her there with a folded packet, thin, unassuming. Updates, she said. Read when you want, or don't. Mara tucked it into her jacket without opening it. Is he still quiet? Yes, Claire replied, and getting louder in the places that count. Mara understood. Quiet predators got loud when the shadows shrank. Loudness was evidence. They walked together toward the river, the air cooling enough to sharpen thought. On the bridge, they paused. The water slid under them with the same patience it always had, but the banks answered differently now. A new line cut the flow. A wider mouth took what the river offered without letting it take back. Mara leaned on the railing. It doesn't feel finished, Claire nodded. It isn't. Then why does it feel steady? Because it moved from reaction to routine, Claire said. That's where change hides. Behind them, engines purred, 6 bikes arriving without announcement, riders dismounting to check corners, to look without looking like they were looking. They didn't approach Mara. They didn't need to. Jonah nodded from a distance and turned back to the underpass, checking the slope again, like he was memorizing it for someone who wasn't there yet. Mara walked down and joined him. Anything shift? She asked. Jonah shook his head. Holds. For now, Mara said. He smiled faintly. You say that like a promise. It's a reminder, she replied. Promises get broken. They stood there in companionable quiet, watching the street keep its shape. At 7, the call came. Claire's phone vibrated once, then again. She stepped aside, listened, and returned with a look that told Mara enough without words. He tried, Claire said. Mara's stomach tightened. Where? 2 blocks west. Different approach, different story. Did it work? No, Claire said, because he couldn't be quiet about it. Mara closed her eyes for a beat. Not relief, confirmation. Is anyone hurt? She asked. No, Claire replied, and that's the point. They walked back toward Cedar together. A small cluster had formed at the far end of the block. Nothing dramatic. An officer stood with a notebook. A shop owner gestured toward a camera. A rider leaned against a bike, arms folded, listening. Mara didn't step into the circle. She didn't need to. Claire did, spoke briefly, then stepped back out. The cluster loosened. The officer left. The shop owner went back inside. The rider checked his watch and nodded to no one. Paperwork had happened. Mara felt the echo of it in her chest, the sense that something had finally been recorded where it would be read later by people who didn't know her and didn't need to. They returned to the cafe steps. The night was cooler now, and the streetlights made honest shadows. "I'm thinking of leaving tomorrow," Mara said quietly. Claire didn't react. "Where?" "Not far," Mara replied. "Just not here." Claire nodded. "That's allowed. I don't want this to be the place I stayed because it was the only place that saw me." Claire smiled, small and understanding. "Then make it the place you left because you could." A rider approached and set a folded paper on the ledge beside Mara. No explanation, no insistence. When he stepped away, Mara opened it. A map, hand-drawn, a few blocks circled, notes in the margins about light, sight lines, places where sound traveled honestly. A phone number written once, then scratched out, then written again. She looked up. Jonah met her eyes from across the street and nodded once. Mara folded the map and slid it into her pocket next to the packet she hadn't opened yet. "Thank you," she said, not loudly. He heard her anyway. At 9, the block thinned again. The bikes rotated down to a handful. The presence stayed light but unmistakable. The city kept breathing. Mara walked the length of Cedar one last time that night, touching the brick with her fingertips as she passed, grounding herself in the fact that it was real and would still be there when she wasn't. She stopped at the donation bins, now empty, lids closed, scheduled to be moved in the morning. She rested her palm on the metal and felt the cold seep in. "You did your job," she murmured. The box for once didn't need anything from her. When she returned to the cafe steps, Claire was waiting with 2 cups of tea. They sat without talking, watching the last delivery truck turn the corner and disappear. "I didn't think anyone would read it," Mara said finally. Claire took a sip. "You wrote it like someone who knew exactly who not to trust." Mara smiled faintly. "That part came easy." The rain threatened again, just a whisper. The street answered without fuss, no pooling, no panic, just water doing what it had been taught to do. Mara stood and stretched. "Tomorrow," she said. Claire nodded. "Tomorrow." As the night wound down, Mara went upstairs and finally opened the packet Claire had given her. Inside, a summary, clean and factual, a timeline, names connected to names, options that were not ultimatums, resources that didn't close behind you when you walked through. She set it aside and lay on the bed, window open, listening to the city test its memory and find it intact. Down on Cedar, a single bike rolled past and kept going. Mara slept. Not deeply, not without dreams, but without the weight of vanishing pressing her into the mattress. In the morning, she would choose a direction, not to escape, not to hide, but to continue with the knowledge that if she ever needed to be seen again, she knew how to write a note the city couldn't ignore. The street had done its part. Now it was her turn to decide what came next. By the 10th hour, the city understood something it didn't have language for. This wasn't escalation, it was saturation. The block didn't erupt, it filled. Bikes arrived the way weather does when the conditions are right. First a change in pressure, then a steady accumulation that made denial impractical. Headlights cut clean lines through the dark and parked without claiming territory. Engines idled low and then went quiet, heat ticking as metal cooled. Riders dismounted and took positions that left lanes open and exits honest. 500 bikes didn't look like a blockade. They looked like a map. Mara stood at the cafe steps and watched the shape take form without anyone calling it in. No chants, no raised arms, no one shouting instructions. The street accepted the presence and adjusted, cars rerouted, pedestrians slowed and chose different corners. A bus paused and then continued on a path it hadn't taken the night before. 500, Claire said softly, not as an announcement, just a fact. Mara didn't respond right away. She felt it first, the weight moving off her chest and into the asphalt beneath her boots, the kind of weight that stayed put because enough people agreed it should. A rider approached and stopped a respectful distance away, helmet under his arm. His eyes tracked the block before they met Mara's, checking that the space was still doing its job. "They asked us to keep lanes clear," he said. "City, fire, ambulance." Mara nodded. "Will you?" "Yes," he replied. "That's how this works." The difference between force and function revealed itself in small moments. A delivery truck edged into the block and stopped, uncertain. Two riders adjusted by inches. One stepped back, another stepped forward, creating a corridor without anyone saying the word. The truck rolled through, driver lifting a hand in thanks he didn't know who to aim at. The city learned. At the far end of Cedar, a line of officers arrived and stood without forming a wall. Their posture wasn't defensive, it was observational. They took in the bikes, the spacing, the quiet, and did the math they were trained to do. Nothing to shut down, everything to note. A sergeant crossed to Claire, spoke quietly, listened more than he talked, then nodded and walked back to his line. Radios stayed silent, pens came out. Paperwork likes quiet. Mara felt the familiar itch to move, to leave before something asked her to stay. She didn't act on it. She let the feeling rise and fall, like water testing a slope that had already been corrected. Across the street, the man appeared again. Not close, never close anymore, but near enough to be seen, far enough to pretend he was passing through. He slowed when he reached the edge of the block and stopped when the density made the lie impossible. He scanned, counted. His posture shifted from entitlement to assessment. He took out his phone, typed, stopped, typed again. The phone went back into his pocket. A rider a few yards away leaned against a pole and checked his watch. Another knelt to adjust a saddlebag strap that didn't need adjusting. A third sat on a curb and drank water, unhurried. The man waited. He tried to find a gap. He found none that didn't come with witnesses. Mara watched him from where she stood and felt something quiet click into place. This wasn't about chasing him off. This was about removing the quiet places he needed to operate. He turned away. No one followed. That restraint mattered more than anything else. At midnight, the prosecutor arrived, not with sirens, not with cameras. He walked the block once, hands in his coat pockets, eyes doing the same reading the riders had done earlier. He stopped near Claire. "You kept it clean," he said. Claire replied. "The street did." He smiled thinly. "That's the best kind." He stepped aside to make a call, voice low, words clipped and exact. When he finished, he nodded to the officers who adjusted their stance without fanfare. Holds extended, filings upgraded, timelines moved, consequences assembled themselves quietly. Mara took a step forward, then another, testing the space the way she'd learned to test rooms. Nothing pushed back. No one corrected her. She stopped near the donation bins, still there, still closed, and rested her hand on the cold metal. The note felt like a lifetime ago, a folded thought she'd let go of, because holding it had become dangerous. "Thank you," she said to no one. The box didn't need it. It had done its job. As the night deepened, the number of bikes thinned and thickened in waves. People rotated out to sleep, others rotated in to hold. The presence didn't disappear. It redistributed, settling into something sustainable. At 1, a light rain began, barely a test. The street answered without drama. No pooling, no rush. Water slid where it had been told to slide. Mara closed her eyes and listened, not for danger, for confirmation. At 2, the cafe owner stepped out and locked the door, nodded to the riders, and left the lights on inside anyway. A small mercy. A signal. At 3, the block felt almost ordinary again, if ordinary meant a city that had learned to hold itself for a night. Claire stood beside Mara. "You don't have to stay until morning." Mara shook her head. "I want to see it through." They stood together as the sky lightened at the edges, gray bleeding into steel. The bikes that remained were fewer now, enough to matter, not enough to dominate. The street had internalized the lesson. At dawn, the city tested one last time. A street sweeper rolled in, slow and tentative. The riders adjusted by inches. The sweeper passed. The street accepted it. That was the signal. By 6, the last clusters peeled away, engines breathing together before separating into different roads. No ceremony, no closing statements, just movement returning to its purpose. Mara watched the block empty until it was just asphalt again, scuffed, marked, changed. She felt the pull to move rise cleanly, not as escape, not as fear. Choice. Claire handed her a folded paper, contacts, options, none of them binding. "For later," she said. Mara took it. "Thank you." Claire nodded. "You did the hard part." Mara looked once more down Cedar, at the place where the street had narrowed without closing, and taught itself how to hold. "I didn't think it would take this many," Claire replied. "It didn't. It took one note written for the right eyes." Mara stepped off the curb and into the morning traffic, which flowed carefully now, like it remembered something it couldn't quite articulate. Behind her, the street opened. Ahead of her, the city offered routes she hadn't needed before. 500 bikes had shut the street down without closing it. What remained wasn't noise. It was space, held long enough for a girl who had learned how to vanish to decide, at last, where she wanted to be seen next. Morning arrived without applause. Cedar Street looked almost ordinary again. Cones stacked neatly at the curb, bikes gone except for faint oil marks that would fade by noon, cafe lights off because they'd earned the right to rest. The city moved the way it always did after holding something heavy through the night, careful at first, then practiced, then forgetful in small, manageable ways. Mara felt the shift in her legs as she walked the block one last time. Not fatigue, decision. The kind that settles after you've stood still long enough for the ground to show you what it will support. Claire met her near the corner with a folded coat and a paper bag that smelled like bread. She didn't hand them over immediately. She waited until Mara looked up and nodded. "Updates," Claire said, tapping the folded packet she'd given her the night before. "They're filing this morning. Holds extended. Charges expanded." Mara absorbed the words without reacting. The man had always relied on things staying informal, on confusion, on people wanting quiet more than truth. Formality would not be his ally. "Anyone else?" Mara asked. Claire nodded. 2 names surfaced from other neighborhoods, similar patterns, different covers. Mara closed her eyes for a beat, not relief, grief, thin and precise. "They'll be contacted." "They already are," Claire said, "and they're being listened to." Mara opened her eyes and looked down the street where the donation bins had stood. Empty now. Scheduled to be moved. Ordinary again. "What breaks?" Mara asked. Claire followed her gaze. The idea that this was a one-off, the belief that quiet equals consent. "And what holds?" Claire didn't hesitate. "Witness." They walked together toward the river. The underpass waited with its new angles, concrete still pale where it had been cut. A city crew stood back and watched water from a hose trace the slope, then nodded and moved on. The work had shifted from urgent to procedural, the most reliable kind. A man approached from the opposite direction, hands visible, posture careful. He introduced himself by name and department, then stopped speaking and waited. "I'm not here to interview you," he said finally. "I'm here to ask if you want a copy of what's been filed." Mara considered. "Not today." He nodded. "If you change your mind, this number gets you directly to me." He set a card on the railing and stepped away without looking back. Mara felt something settle. Access without pressure. Another quiet correction. By late morning, the city's memory had moved on to its next concern. Traffic flowed. A busker tuned his guitar 2 blocks over. The cafe owner unlocked the door and swept last night's footprints without comment. Mara climbed the stairs above the cafe and packed lightly. Habit. The folded packet. The map Jonah had drawn. A change of clothes that felt less borrowed now. She left the room as she'd found it. Window open, bed neat, no trace that demanded explanation. Downstairs, Claire waited. "You don't have to leave today," Claire said. "I know," Mara replied. "I want to." "Where?" "Not far," Mara said. "Just not here." Claire nodded. "You want company?" Mara shook her head gently. "I want choice." They stood there for a moment, neither rushing the goodbye into something heavier than it needed to be. "You did something difficult," Claire said. "Not brave, difficult." Mara smiled faintly. "I wrote a note." "You refused to disappear," Claire corrected. Outside, the air had that post-storm clarity that made edges sharp and decisions honest. Mara stepped onto Cedar and felt the street accept her without comment. No one tracked her, no one adjusted around her. The lesson had been absorbed. She crossed the bridge, and paused to look at the water. It slid under the span without hurry, obedient to the new lines it had been given. She thought of the night the street narrowed without closing, of 500 engines breathing together and then letting go. She thought of how quiet had tried to kill her and how witnesses had interrupted that math. A bike rolled past on the far road, just one. The rider didn't look over. Mara didn't need him to. She walked until the city thinned and the sidewalks told the truth again. She stopped at a corner store and bought food she didn't have to ration. She ate it slowly, letting her body learn that later would still exist. At the edge of town, she took out the map Jonah had drawn. Not directions, observations. Places where sound traveled honestly, where light lied, where quiet turned predatory. She folded it and put it away. That afternoon, her phone buzzed with a message she hadn't expected. "You don't know me." I read the note after it was filed. "If you want to talk later, I'll listen. No name, no demand." Mara stared at the screen, then locked the phone and slipped it back into her pocket. Later. By evening, she found a place to rest that wasn't hidden, just unclaimed. A small room with a window that opened from the inside. No curfew, no intake form slid across a desk. She sat on the bed and listened to the city breathe, letting the day prove itself again. She thought about the man, now loud in places he couldn't control. She thought about the street, which had learned to hold without gripping. She thought about the donation box, how it had carried a folded truth to hands that knew how to open it. Mara lay back and closed her eyes, not to disappear, to rest. Tomorrow would come with its own choices, paperwork, conversations, routes she hadn't needed before. Tonight, the weight had shifted where it belonged. The street had opened again. The witnesses had gone home. What remained was quieter than fear and stronger than relief. Agency. Mara slept with the window open, listening not for footsteps, not for engines, but for the ordinary sounds of a city that had been taught, briefly, precisely, how to see. That was enough to carry her into whatever came next. The street opened again the way it always did. Not all at once, not ceremonially. Just enough that people could pretend it had never closed. By the 12th day, Cedar looked like itself. Delivery trucks double-parked where they always had, buses rolling through on schedule, the cafe chalkboard wiped clean of last week's specials. The donation bins were gone, replaced by bare sidewalk and a faint square of cleaner concrete where something heavy had stood for a while. Mara walked it one last time without stopping. She didn't test the edges anymore. She didn't count exits. She let her steps fall where they wanted to fall and watched how the city answered back. It did. Calmly. Predictably. Like a place that had learned something and was hoping not to forget it too quickly. Claire met her at the bridge, not because she had to, but because endings deserved witnesses too. "You sure?" Claire asked. Mara nodded. "I don't want this place to become the reason I stayed." Claire smiled. "Then let it be the reason you left." They stood together for a minute, watching the river slide beneath the span. The water moved cleanly now, redirected but not constrained, the way things did best when they were listened to instead of fought. "Paperwork will keep moving," Claire said. "People will keep calling. Some of them will mean well." "I know," Mara replied, "and some won't." Mara met her eyes. "I know that too." Claire reached into her coat and pulled out a small envelope. No logo. No official seal. Just a name written neatly on the front. "Use it or don't," Claire said. "It's a door that opens from the inside." Mara took it and slipped it into her pocket without opening it. "Thank you." They didn't hug. They didn't promise to stay in touch. They respected the shape of what had happened enough not to soften it with sentiment. Mara crossed the bridge alone. On the far side, the city thinned into routes she hadn't needed before. Side streets that led to transit lines, paths that didn't require permission, corners where you could stand without being asked what you were doing. She chose one at random and followed it until the air smelled different. She stopped at a small store and bought a notebook she didn't need to hide. She paid in cash that hadn't been borrowed or bartered. The clerk wished her a good day without looking twice. That mattered. In the afternoon, rain passed through quickly, just enough to darken the pavement and test the drains. Mara stood under an awning and watched water do what it had been taught to do. No pooling, no panic. The city answered the question correctly and moved on. She smiled, just a little. By evening, she found a place to rest that didn't feel temporary, even if it was. A room with a window that opened and closed on her terms. She set her bag down and stood in the center of the floor, letting the quiet settle without threatening her. She thought of the donation box, how it had looked ordinary, how easy it would have been to walk past it one more time. She thought of the folded paper, the pencil pressed hard enough to bruise the page, the moment of letting go when she'd known there was no undo. She hadn't asked to be saved, she had asked not to vanish. Her phone buzzed once near dusk, a message from an unfamiliar number, streets holding, underpass too. Just letting you know. No name, no expectation. Mara typed a reply and erased it. Some acknowledgments didn't need words. She walked to the window and looked out at the city as night assembled itself, lights flicking on, engines humming, people choosing routes without thinking about why those routes felt safer now. Somewhere, the man who had controlled her movements was explaining himself to people who wrote things down and didn't forget. Somewhere else, other girls were being listened to for the first time, their quiet finally finding surfaces it could stick to. Mara didn't follow those threads. She didn't need to. She lay on the bed with the window open and listened to the ordinary sounds of a place that had been forced, briefly, to pay attention. Her body relaxed in stages, unlearning habits that had kept her alive but small. Tomorrow, she would move again. Or she wouldn't. She would decide based on weather and opportunity and the feel of the ground under her feet. That was the difference now. The street had closed to protect her. It had opened so she could leave. 500 bikes had shut it down without claiming it, and then they'd gone, leaving behind something harder to dismantle than barricades, memory, witness, choice. Mara closed her eyes and slept, not deeply, not without dreams, but without the fear of disappearing pressing against her ribs. The city would forget parts of this. Cities always do. But it wouldn't forget all of it, and neither would she.